July 8, 1965, Wandsworth Prison, London. 4 men over the wall in broad daylight. And the craziest part? They used rope ladders, thrown over a 7-meter wall, during the prisoners' 1-hour exercise break. Ronald Biggs was serving 30 years for the Great Train Robbery. On July 8th, a furniture van pulled up beside the wall. 2 rope ladders sailed over, and Biggs climbed to freedom. But this isn't just a story about scaling a wall. It's about the 2 lifers who tackled the guards so Biggs could climb, the plastic surgery that erased his face, and the 36 years on the run that ended with him walking back to prison voluntarily. He sold his story to a newspaper. The paper called Scotland Yard instead. Biggs was in handcuffs, but not for long. This is how a small-time carpenter pulled off one of the most famous prison escapes in British history. Ronald Arthur Biggs, age 35, armed robbery, 30 years. Before the Great Train Robbery, Biggs had been nobody. A petty thief from Lambeth, South London. Working class, no prospects. Breaking into chemists at night. Unsuccessful at almost everything he tried. His main skill was carpentry. He built things with his hands. He wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't a planner. He was a man who happened to know the right people at the wrong time. He drifted into petty crime as a teenager and spent most of his 20s bouncing in and out of minor trouble. The kind of criminal that police barely bothered with. A nuisance, not a threat. The sort of man who would have lived and died in obscurity if one phone call hadn't changed everything. In 1963, a member of the gang planning the train robbery needed a carpenter, someone who could help access the train's interior. Biggs got the call. It was the luckiest and unluckiest moment of his entire life. On August 8, 1963, a 15-member gang stopped a Royal Mail train traveling from Glasgow to London. They overpowered the crew and made off with £2.5 million in used banknotes. It was the biggest robbery in British history. The newspapers called it the Great Train Robbery. The story captivated the nation. And when the gang was caught, the courts made an example of every last one of them. Biggs received 30 years, the same sentence as the ringleaders, the same sentence as the men who had planned, financed, and executed the entire operation. Everyone was shocked. The police were shocked. The public were shocked. A carpenter who had played a minor role was going to spend 3 decades behind bars. The judge wanted to send a message. Biggs was part of that message. Why would a court give the same sentence to a carpenter as it gave to the masterminds? He arrived at Wandsworth Prison expecting to keep his head down, do his time quietly, earn remission for good behavior. Maybe get out in 15 years instead of 30. He had a wife and 2 young children. He told himself he would see them again. He just had to be patient. But the prison had other plans. After another great train robber attempted an escape from a different facility, the authorities tightened security on every member of the gang. Biggs found a light burning in his cell 24 hours a day. Constant surveillance, restricted movement. He was being watched every second of every day. Sleep became impossible. Privacy became a memory. He wrote letters to politicians, complained about his treatment rather than keeping me in prison. He wrote, "You're doing everything you can to push me over that wall." Nobody listened, nobody cared, and so Biggs made a decision. If they were going to treat him like an escape risk, he might as well become one. With a 30-year sentence, who wouldn't be desperate to get out? Wandsworth was a fortress, Victorian, massive, built in 1851 and barely modernized since. The largest prison in London, a grim, sprawling complex that smelled of damp stone and disinfectant. The corridors were narrow, the cells were cramped. The atmosphere was suffocating even before you considered the walls. And the walls were the real problem. Sheer stone, 7 meters high, smooth enough that no man could find a handhold. They surrounded every exercise yard like the sides of a pit. Guards walked the perimeter during every recreation period. Watchtowers overlooked the yards from elevated positions. There was no blind spot, no dead angle, no shadow deep enough to hide in. The prison held over 1,000 inmates, murderers, armed robbers, violent offenders. Prisoners were locked down 23 hours a day, allowed only 1 hour of exercise, even then, under strict supervision. The security was designed to match the population. Prisoners moved in groups, counted at every transition, watched at every moment. The idea of climbing over the wall in daylight, during exercise, with guards standing in the yard, was absurd. It was the kind of plan that only a desperate man would consider. How do you escape from a prison where you only have 60 minutes outside your cell? But Wandsworth had one weakness that its designers hadn't anticipated. The exercise yard sat against the outer wall, and on the other side of that wall was a public street. An ordinary London street where anyone could park a vehicle, a tall vehicle, a furniture van, perhaps. A van that could bring a man within arm's reach of the top. If someone on the outside could throw a rope ladder over the wall at precisely the right moment, a prisoner in the yard below could climb it before the guards crossed the distance. It would require perfect timing, absolute coordination between inside and outside, and someone willing to buy the climber a few precious seconds. Could anyone scale 7 meters of stone before the guards reached them? The plan came together through a man named Paul Seaborn. He was a mate of Biggs inside Wandsworth. Shocked by the 30-year sentence, determined to get Biggs out, Seaborn was due for release, which made him the perfect accomplice. He could coordinate everything from the outside. There was one condition. Seaborn's friend Eric Flower had to come too. Biggs agreed without hesitation. 2 men over the wall instead of 1. The more chaos, the better. In May 1965, Seaborn walked out of Wandsworth, a free man. He carried with him a share of Biggs's split from the robbery. Not a huge sum. Most of the money had been spent or seized, but enough to fund what came next. The first purchase was a large furniture van, a removal truck, the kind of vehicle you saw on every street in London. Nobody would look twice at it parked against a wall. Then he modified it, cut a section in the roof that could be raised an extra 5 feet on a spring mechanism. When extended, a man standing on the van could reach the top of the prison wall. When retracted, it looked like an ordinary truck. Seaborn spent weeks studying the layout around Wandsworth. He identified the street alongside the exercise yard, timed the guard patrols, calculated how long it would take to park the van, extend the roof, throw the ladders, and wait for the climbers. Every second mattered. If the van sat there too long, a passing police car might notice. If the ladders went over too early, the prisoners wouldn't be in position. If they went over too late, exercise hour would be ending. What if the van was spotted before the ladders went over? What if a patrol car turned the corner at the wrong moment? The plan was straightforward. Seaborn would park the van against the outer wall at exactly 3:05 p.m. on July 8th. He and an accomplice in a separate car would approach the prison simultaneously. From a nearby block of flats, Seaborn would scan the yard through binoculars and confirm the signal. Prison jackets slung over their shoulders. That meant Biggs and Flower were ready. Then the ladders would go over. 2 rope ladders, one for Biggs, one for Flower, climb up, drop onto the van, into a waiting getaway car, gone. Simple, almost ridiculously simple, but simplicity was the point. No tunnels to collapse, no disguises to see through, no months of digging to unravel. Just a van, 2 ladders, and 60 seconds of pure nerve. But there was one critical problem. The guards. 2 officers patrolled the exercise yard during recreation. If they saw the ladders hit the wall, they could reach Biggs and Flower before either man made it halfway up. 7 meters was a long climb. Even a fit man needed 15 to 20 seconds on a rope ladder. That was an eternity with guards sprinting toward you. Biggs needed someone to slow them down. He found his answer in two lifers. Men serving life sentences with nothing to lose. No parole hearings to worry about. No good behavior credits to protect. For £500 each, they agreed to tackle the guards the moment the ladders appeared. £500 to buy Biggs maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. Enough time to reach the top. Everything depended on timing. 1 hour of exercise, one window, one chance. Remember those two lifers? Their £500 was about to become the best investment Biggs ever made. July 8th, 1965, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The prisoners of Wandsworth filed into the exercise yard for their daily hour of recreation. Biggs and Flower walked among them, prison jackets slung over their shoulders. That was the signal. They were ready. From the top of a nearby block of flats, Seaborn watched through binoculars. He scanned the yard, found Biggs, found Flower, saw the jackets. Game on. Seaborn and his accomplice drove the modified furniture van along the street outside the prison, an ordinary removal truck on an ordinary London street. Nobody looked twice. They pulled up against the wall of the exercise yard. The engine idled. Seaborn checked his watch, checked the street. No police cars, no pedestrians stopping to stare. The coast was clear. The spring-loaded roof section rose with a metallic groan, 5 extra feet of height. Seaborn climbed up. 2 rope ladders coiled in his hands. He could hear the murmur of prisoners on the other side of the wall. The guards' boots on the concrete. 100 men exercising 20 feet away, separated by 7 meters of Victorian stone. One deep breath. He threw the ladders over. 3:05 p.m. The ladders sailed over the wall. Inside the yard, Biggs saw them hit the stone. Flower saw them. They broke into a sprint. Straight for the wall. Flat out. Everything they had. 2 guards spotted them instantly. Gave chase. The distance was closing fast. 20 meters. 15. 10. Then the lifers moved. 2 men with nothing to lose threw themselves at the guards, tackled them to the ground. Bodies tangled on the concrete. Shouts, confusion. The guards fought to break free. One almost got to his feet. The lifer dragged him back down, pinned him, held on with everything he had. £500 well earned. Biggs reached the ladder, grabbed the rope, started climbing, hand over hand. 7 meters between him and freedom. His arms burned. His feet slipped on the smooth stone wall. The rope twisted with every pull. Below him, the yard was erupting into chaos. Shouts from the guards, shouts from the prisoners, the sound of bodies hitting concrete. Don't look down. Just climb. 3 meters up, the rope swayed. Biggs's foot slipped off a rung. For one sickening moment, he hung by his hands alone. 7 meters of empty air beneath him. His fingers screamed. He scrambled, found the rung again, kept climbing. Was anyone behind him? Were the guards free? He couldn't look, couldn't stop. Every second on this wall was a second closer to being grabbed from below. 4 meters? 5. The top of the wall was getting closer. His shoulders burned. His grip was weakening. But he could see the edge now. Just a few more pulls. Flower was right behind him on the second ladder, climbing fast, pulling himself up with the desperation of a man who knew what 30 years looked like from the inside. Then something nobody had planned for. 2 other prisoners saw the opportunity. Men who had nothing to do with the escape. They sprinted for the ladders and started climbing behind Flower. 4 men on 2 rope ladders. The weight pulled the ropes taut. The ladders groaned under the strain. Could 4 men clear the top before reinforcements reached the wall? Alarm bells exploded across the prison. The sound cut through the yard like a knife. Officers flooded in from every direction, doors slamming open, boots pounding on concrete, radio calls crackling through the air. But it was too late. Biggs reached the top, swung his leg over, looked down the other side. The modified van waited below. A 3-meter drop to the roof. He jumped, hit the roof hard, scrambled to his feet. Flower was next. Then the 2 opportunists. 4 men, one after another, dropping onto the van roof. They scrambled down the back to a waiting getaway car. Engine running, doors open. They piled in. The car tore into the streets of southeast London. Behind them, Wandsworth Prison erupted. Sirens, shouts, guards scrambling to the walls, but the car was already gone. Swallowed by the city. Every police siren in the distance made Biggs's heart stop. Every intersection was a risk. Every red light felt like an eternity, but the driver knew the streets. He wove through traffic, turned down side roads, avoided the main arteries where patrol cars would be. Within minutes, they were in the clear. The prison was behind them. London stretched out ahead, a city of 8 million people, and somewhere in it, 4 fugitives disappearing into the afternoon traffic. Inside the prison, the reaction split along predictable lines. The guards were furious. They had been made to look like fools. The prisoners were ecstatic. Men shouted from their cell windows, "Well done," boys, cheering, laughing, knowing exactly how much it was getting under the officer's skin. And then they were out. London, July 8th, 1965. For the first time in 2 years, no walls, no cell light burning through the night, no guards counting every breath. Just the backseat of a car speeding through London, the July afternoon sun coming through the windows. Streets full of ordinary people who had no idea that one of the most wanted men in England was driving past them. Biggs and Flower were taken to a safe house in South London. His hands were raw from the rope. His legs were shaking. The adrenaline was still surging through his body. For a few glorious hours, the euphoria was overwhelming. He had done it. He had beaten the wall, beaten the guards, beaten the system that had given him 30 years for being a carpenter. But the euphoria didn't last. By evening, reality hit. He was the most wanted man in England. His face was on every front page, every television bulletin. Every police station in the country had his photograph pinned to the wall. The safe house suddenly felt less safe. Where do you go when the entire country is looking for you? Within hours, Scotland Yard launched the biggest manhunt London had seen since the war. Every police officer in the metropolitan area had Biggs's photograph. Patrol cars circled South London. Detectives knocked on doors. Informants were squeezed. The press went into a frenzy. The Great Train Robber had escaped. Front-page news on every paper in England. Biggs couldn't stay in London. Every airport had his photograph. Every port was being watched. Every railway station was covered. How do you leave a country when every exit is blocked? The answer was a fishing boat. Under cover of darkness, Biggs and Flower were smuggled across the English Channel to France. A small vessel on a choppy sea. No customs. No passport control. Just 2 men crouched below deck, watching the English coastline disappear behind them. They landed in a country where their faces were less known, but they were far from safe. British police had already alerted Interpol. Their photographs were circulating across Europe. Time was running out. In France, both men underwent plastic surgery. New faces, new identities. The surgeons altered their jawlines, their noses, their brows, enough that they no longer matched their mugshots. There was even talk of removing their fingerprints, though that proved impractical. It was radical, painful, weeks of recovery with swollen, bandaged faces. But without new faces, they would be recognized the moment they stepped off a plane anywhere in the English-speaking world. The total cost of the escape, the plastic surgery, the flights, the payments to everyone involved came to between £40,000 and £50,000. Nearly everything Biggs had left from the robbery. Could new faces buy him a new life? Unrecognizable. They chose Australia. Biggs missed his wife and their 2 children desperately. If he was ever going to reunite with his family, it had to be somewhere where English children wouldn't stand out. Somewhere far from Scotland Yard's reach. Australia was the answer. The family settled in Melbourne in late 1965. Biggs went back to carpentry, his original trade, the trade that had gotten him invited onto the Great Train Robbery in the first place. For 4 years, he lived quietly, a carpenter in a suburb, a fugitive hiding in plain sight. He built furniture, went to work, came home, acted normal. Nobody suspected the quiet Englishman on their street was one of the most wanted men in Britain. But how long could he stay invisible? Then in 1969, 4 years into his new life, everything fell apart. Flower was captured by Australian police. The heat turned on Biggs immediately. Squads of detectives carried dossiers of photographs. Melbourne was no longer safe. Would Australia be the end of the road? Or could he outrun Scotland Yard one more time? In 1970, with police closing in on his family, Biggs fled again, this time to Rio de Janeiro, alone, leaving his wife and children behind. He always believed he would get back to them, but he knew that now that his family had been found, the authorities would be watching them around the clock. He would never see them the same way again. In Rio, Biggs found a girlfriend, a local woman. He settled into a cheap hotel room. The glamour of the Great Train Robbery had long since faded. He was a middle-aged Englishman living alone in a foreign city. No money, no prospects, no friends. The loneliness was crushing. The sun and the beaches meant nothing when you had no one to share them with. Desperate for cash, he tried to sell his story to a Brazilian newspaper. Easy money, he thought. A famous fugitive's memoir. The papers would pay thousands for it. Remember that newspaper deal? It was about to backfire spectacularly. The paper double-crossed him, called Scotland Yard instead. Within days, British detectives were on a plane to Rio. Biggs was arrested, handcuffed, photographed. After 5 years on the run across 3 continents, the Great Escape was over. But not for long. Scotland Yard had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed they could walk into Brazil, flash their badges, and take Biggs home. What they didn't realize was that Brazil was under a military dictatorship. Under Brazilian law, Biggs could not be extradited. There was no treaty, no legal mechanism. And with his Brazilian girlfriend now pregnant, Biggs couldn't be expelled either. Brazilian law protected the fathers of Brazilian children. Biggs was released. A convicted felon in a country that wouldn't send him home. The man who couldn't escape a 30-year sentence in England had found the one place on earth where British justice couldn't reach him. He made ends meet as a minor celebrity. Journalists offered money. Tourists paid to have their picture taken with him. He hosted barbecues for paying guests, told stories about the robbery, charged for photographs. He became a curiosity, a living relic of a bygone era of British crime. It looked like the life of Riley. Sun, beaches, the great train robber living free in paradise, while Scotland Yard ground their teeth in frustration. But the reality was less glamorous. He was broke most of the time. He couldn't work legally. The tourist money was unpredictable. He lived in modest rooms, not luxury apartments, and there was always a price on his head. Always someone calculating whether bringing Biggs back to Britain was worth the effort. In 1981, someone decided it was. On March 6th, a soldier of fortune and a team of 4 men kidnapped Biggs in Rio, grabbed him off the street, bound him, flew him 2,000 miles across Brazil in a light plane to the country's northern coast. From there, the kidnappers sailed for Barbados. The plan was to land on British Commonwealth soil and hand Biggs over for extradition back to England. The story exploded across the world's media. The Great Train Robber kidnapped by bounty hunters. Was this finally the end? His lawyers played the last card, his Brazilian son. Under Brazilian law, the father of a Brazilian child could not be permanently removed from the country. The legal challenge was fought under the glare of international media. Cameras from every continent pointed at the courthouse. Biggs won. Again. 6 weeks after being kidnapped. He was back in Rio. Free. Still untouchable. He had beaten Scotland Yard. He had beaten the bounty hunters. He had beaten every attempt to bring him to justice. How many more times could he cheat the system? For the next 20 years, he stayed in Brazil. But public interest faded. The money dried up. The tourists stopped coming. A series of strokes left him barely able to speak. The Great Train Robber grew old and forgotten. Was it worth it? The escape? The decades of running? The loneliness? In 2001, at the age of 72, Biggs made a choice that stunned everyone. He came home, broke, sick, unable to speak after multiple strokes. He boarded a plane paid for by a newspaper and flew back to England. When the plane touched down, a Scotland Yard detective was waiting on the tarmac with the original warrant from 1965. The same warrant that had been issued the day Biggs went over the wall at Wandsworth. 36 years old, still valid, still waiting for him. I have here in my possession a warrant for your arrest, for being unlawfully at large from Her Majesty's Prison Wandsworth. 36 years after climbing that rope ladder, Biggs was back in custody. He was sent to Belmarsh Prison, London's highest security facility. The same city he had fled in 1965. The same justice system he had evaded for more than half his life. Would the most famous fugitive in British history spend his final years behind bars? His son visited him. The brain is perfect, he said. The body is not. He'll never speak again. He'll never eat or drink again. He gets fed by a tube. He'll never walk properly again. But his mind is intact. Biggs could think. He could remember. Every moment, the escape, Melbourne, Rio. He could remember what freedom tasted like, but he couldn't tell anyone. Trapped inside a body that had betrayed him. Locked inside a prison he had voluntarily returned to. He was released on compassionate grounds in 2009, at the age of 79. He died on December 18, 2013, 84 years old. After more than 3 decades on the run, across 4 countries and 3 continents, the man who climbed over the wall of Wandsworth Prison ended up exactly where he started, in a cell in London. The Great Train Robbery netted £2.5 million. Biggs spent nearly everything he had on running: plastic surgery, flights, safe houses, bribes. 40 to 50,000 pounds just to escape and start over. By the end, he had nothing. The robbery that was supposed to set him up for life left him broke, sick, and bedridden. To this day, the 1965 Wandsworth escape remains one of the most audacious prison breaks in British history. Not because of its complexity, because of its simplicity. A van, 2 rope ladders, 2 lifers willing to tackle the guards, and 60 seconds of chaos that changed Ronnie Biggs's life forever. A carpenter who built nothing that lasted, except the legend. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.